In this neck of the woods, water is a highly charged word because it doesn't mean drinking water.
Y el día anterior me acuerdo que estaba muy soleado y al otro día empezó a llover. Y fue súper curioso, la verdad, porque después siguió lloviendo.
La verdad que fue felicidad, porque desde que me había venido a Santiago que no veía llover. Entonces la verdad es que nunca pensé que podría pasar algo más.
In 2015, two cities on opposite sides of the world each experienced an extreme rainfall event which led to flooding. On March 25th, in the desert city of Copiapó in Chile, roads became torrents of muddy water as exceptionally heavy rain caused the Copiapó River to burst its banks.
Me acuerdo de haber levantado y haber visto cómo estaba pasando el agua por afuera de mi casa. Pasó el agua, botó los postes, me acuerdo. Me acuerdo de haber mucho susto en ese momento porque los postes quedaron colgando prácticamente y mucha gente tuvo como miedo al tipo de electrocutarse y todo el tema.
Then on June 3rd, the New Zealand city of Dunedin received 3 months' worth of rain in 24 hours, resulting in surface flooding across much of the low-lying district of South Dunedin.
Flooding is scary because you don't know where it's going to stop. Yeah.
As greenhouse gas emissions from human activity contribute to warming of the Earth's atmosphere, weather patterns around the world are changing. Despite being separated by thousands of miles of ocean, Chile and New Zealand are facing similar challenges as their changing climates result in weather events that are becoming more frequent and more extreme.
And the problem with climate change is that for every 1 degree of warming that we have in the atmosphere, we can hold about 7% more water. And that means that when it starts to rain, we dump out that 7% more water for that 1 degree more. So the extreme events we get are more extreme than they were.
Unfortunately, most modern cities are not designed to cope with vast quantities of water. Impermeable roofs, roads and pavements all prevent water from soaking into the ground, and so the most densely populated parts of our planet rely on networks of drains to transport rainwater away as quickly as it falls. When rainfall exceeds the limits of these stormwater systems, cities inevitably flood, sometimes with catastrophic results.
Y en ese rato no se pudo detener mucho el agua. Yo vivo en una casa de 2 pisos y entró el agua al antijardín, entró barro, por afuera pasaban escombros, sillones, lavadoras, refrigeradores.
And often, the recovery period is as traumatic as the flood.
No teníamos botas para el barro, no teníamos anteojos para el polvo, no teníamos mascarilla para el polvo que se estaba circulando. No había comida tampoco, porque nadie sabía que esto iba a pasar, por lo tanto nadie tenía mercadería guardada.
For a lot of renters, their landlords didn't come up with any insurance, so people lost everything. These are people who had no resource to set themselves up again, and things were very bad for them.
So what can be done to minimise the risk and help vulnerable communities prepare for and cope with flooding in the future? The first step is studying the climate, weather and landscape so that we can understand when and how extreme rainfall events are likely to result in flooding in different areas.
Hay que entender bien los fenómenos de lo que ocurre. A pesar de que nos vamos secando, que va a llover menos, la inundación se produce cuando llueve mucho en poco tiempo. Históricamente en Chile ha llovido con una temperatura medianamente baja. Cuando ocurre eso, la zona, cuando uno detecta la altura sobre la cual nieva y bajo la cual llueve, esa línea está relativamente baja. Cuando llueve y hace mayor calor, esta línea sobre la cual hay nieve y bajo la cual hay agua líquida pasa a estar más alta. Al estar más alto, el área que contribuye a caudal aumenta. Entonces, esta mayor área que contribuye a caudal nos genera inundación.
So the problem in South Dunedin is that it's a very low-lying, flat area that's close to sea level and it has very shallow groundwater. So there's only about a metre's worth of ground that can absorb the rain before it starts flowing out across the surface. We monitor that with a series of boreholes in the ground and some pressure transducers that record the water level every 10 minutes or 15 minutes depending on how we've set them. And we can see how responsive different areas in the city are to rainfall.
Once we understand the urban environment, we can start developing initiatives to try and minimise the risk of flooding in the future.
So clearly the city having a good stormwater network is fundamentally important, and a lot of work's been done to improve the network. Ultimately though, as sea level rise comes further, we have to start thinking about other solutions around whether we need to store the water locally, to hump and hollow the ground, or to change the design of our streets so that the water's not shedding off the streets and into the properties.
Uno podría hacer las plazas de las ciudades zonas más bajas que puedan drenar. Entonces, cosa que el agua, cuando se empieza a inundar algo, se empieza a inundar, no solo digo el borde del río, sino tal vez en otros lugares de las plazas. Si uno le bajara la cota a las plazas, lo que se va a inundar en la masa. Funciona como un mini embalse momentáneo, y eso sí creo que es atractivo.
Around the world, city planners are taking inspiration from nature to replace or integrate traditional concrete and steel with living green solutions for urban water management. In China, over 250 sponge cities have been built and adapted to absorb and use water rather than transport it away. Similar concepts are also at work in Berlin, Germany, where the district of Rimmelberg has been constructed without conventional drains. Rainwater is instead absorbed by green walls and roofs, and excess runoff transported through vegetated channels called swales. These absorb water while slowing down its flow, reducing peak runoff and enabling contaminants to be filtered out as stormwater soaks into the soil. Meanwhile, the Australian city of Melbourne has drastically changed the way it manages water after it experienced a 13-year drought followed by multiple flash floods. Pavements and roads have been replaced with permeable alternatives, while numerous tree pits and rain gardens have been planted to help absorb rainwater in places where it was previously transported as quickly as possible out of the city. Stormwater is collected in parks and wetlands where vegetation and microorganisms clean the water, enabling it to be stored for later use. This source for irrigation takes some pressure off the city water supply in times of drought and reduces the amount of contaminated runoff from the city during periods of rain. As an added bonus, evaporation from all the additional vegetation helps keep the city cooler in hot weather, leading to more pleasant living conditions and reduced energy costs. Unfortunately, the transition from grey to green infrastructure is not a one-size-fits-all solution, and some initiatives that work well in one place may not be practical elsewhere.
Los techos verdes y cosas de ese estilo son opciones muy atractivas, pero hay que entender la realidad local. Si tengo un techo verde, en la práctica tengo una mini piscina con tierra o suelo y con vegetación sobre mi cabeza. Eso tiene que estar muy bien impermeabilizado. ¿Ya? En Chile hay grandes problemas de impermeabilización de obras que no tienen techos verdes. De hecho, es como los grandes problemas de postventa en la construcción, el agua.
Around the world, flooding and other natural disasters have a disproportionately high impact on low-income communities, where people are already struggling with poverty, poor infrastructure and other social issues. In such cases, efforts to adapt to climate change provide an opportunity for city planners to find solutions that will address multiple problems at the same time.
As we've got into this process, we've realised that it's going to be quite complicated. It's going to be multi-generational and multidisciplinary. We need to reduce the flood risk, deal with climate change, and we also need to figure out sort of some of the entrenched housing and poverty issues that we know have been here a long time.
One of the biggest challenges is finding a balance between what will work to reduce flooding potential and what can be accommodated by the communities at risk.
Las soluciones que dieron el gobierno en ese momento fue: se van de acá, es un lugar que no se puede vivir. Y la gente hizo protestas, se quemaron neumáticos, se cortaron calles, como para obtener mejor respuesta, y al final no pasó nada. Y luego de eso volvieron a ensanchar el río, esta vez ya prácticamente al triple doble. Y eso fue lo único las medidas que se tomaron después de eso.
There was a lot of anger because it builds on a community that feels itself to have been ignored and disrespected for generations. And I have to say the DCC has really come to the party with that. They know, as we do, that this community is going to be affected by climate change, and they know that the community has to be involved in that.
Possibilities are kind of endless, and the question is, what's the most effective here in reducing flood risk? What's the community up for? How much does it cost? What's your bang for your buck? And ultimately, sort of, what can we do that we know is guaranteed to work? The problem with climate change is that you don't know when things are going to happen. You have a good scientific understanding of what's likely to happen, but you don't know when. So the way that the planning approach is done now is called a dynamic adaptive pathways. We agree in advance of the things that we don't want to happen, or when they happen we will do these three things. Then it doesn't matter when they happen, but when they do we'll be ready.
Que básicamente uno tiene que estar preparado cada vez que vaya a chispear o que haya tormenta eléctrica.
It's not easy, it's a tricky problem, but we've got good brains in this city and I think we do well.